Hello, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started with oral session number 3 on work and employment. So my name's Thomas Helgerman. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Work and Organizations at the University of Minnesota, and I'm going to be the session chair for this session today. So I'm going to start off before we get started by introducing all of the speakers that you'll see. The first talk will be given by Guohui Jiang. He's presenting Red Tail's Broken Wings, Talent Misallocation Among America's Most Talented African Americans. Guohui is a postdoc at the University of Cologne, Germany, and he received his PhD from the University of Zurich last year. Our second speaker will be Aaron Ainsworth. He will be presenting the differential impact of becoming a parent on K-12 teachers' career trajectories for women and men. Aaron is a fifth-year PhD candidate in education policy at the University of California, Irvine. His research uses large-scale administrative data to understand how K-12 education systems can be organized to improve short and long-run student outcomes. Aaron is also on the 2026-2027 job market. Our next speaker will be Guilherme Junqueira. He'll be presenting Entrepreneurship on a Safety Net, Evidence from the World's Largest Cash Transfer Program. Guilherme is a finance PhD candidate at the University of Florida, advised by Murillo Campello. In fall 2026, he will be a visiting PhD student at Dartmouth's Tuck School of Business, hosted by Gordon Phillips, and will join the 5th cohort of WEFI Fellows. His research has been presented at NBER meetings, cited in the 2026 Joint Economic Report of the U.S. Congress, and supported by a fellowship from the NBER Innovation Information Initiative. Our next speaker will be Sophie Lee, presenting Returns to Education for Women, Evidence from U.S. Compulsory Schooling Laws. Sophie is an assistant professor at the University of Southern Denmark. Her research fields are economic history, labor economics, and economics of gender. Before moving to Denmark, she obtained her PhD in economics at Boston University. And our final speaker will be Becca Brough, presenting Effects of Female Employment, Evidence from Teacher Certification Exams. Becca is a PhD candidate in economics at UC Davis. Her work spans topics in labor, public, and economic history, with a focus on policies and institutions that affect women. She will be on the job market this coming fall.
Thank you for having me. Sorry for the change of the title. This is a joint work with BC and Jenny from the U.S. Census Bureau and Joachim from University of Zurich. The black and white income difference in the U.S. is substantial and persistent. From 1940, the median earning of black men never reached even half of white men's. One interpretation for this is discrimination. Black workers are paid less for the same task. But it's also possible that black and white workers on the labor market have different skills. But disentangle the two is tricky. So the traditional way of doing that is when we run a regression, we have this black dummy, we also control skill proxies, such as education and cognitive ability. But the question is, skill difference is also the consequence of systematic discrimination against African Americans in the society. But there's a way around this. An ideal experiment would be we have a cohort of African Americans immediately before they enter the labor market. Then we get them exposed to different levels of discrimination and track their outcome differences over their entire life. Of course, this is highly unethical, but there's one setting which is closer to this ideal experiment. In 1942, for the first time in history, the U.S. Army Air Forces allowed African Americans to attend military pilot training in a segregated airfield around Tuskegee, Alabama. So these 1,000 black individuals passed the similar selection, experienced a similar training, and eventually earned their wings. They became known as the Tuskegee Airmen. Lee Archer and Terry Bailey are great examples. Bailey was born in North Carolina, and Archer was born in New York. They both became pilots in their early 20s. But what happened to them after World War II is dramatically different. Billy returned to his parents' home, Richmond, Virginia, a place with a history of discrimination against African Americans. Despite his qualifications and skills, he couldn't find a job as a commercial airline pilot. He tried to become a mechanic, he failed. Eventually, he became a mail carrier in 1952. In contrast, Lee Archer returned to his birthplace, New York. He joined the General Foods Corporation and then became its vice president. He actually was the first Black vice president in a major US corporation. Now you may tell me, well, New York is richer. People are more likely to succeed in a richer environment. Well, let's consider two white pilots from the same locations. John Whiteman from New York. He owned a billboard company, but his buddy, Noah Tipton, didn't perform worse. He lived in Richmond, but he owned 3 companies, including a commercial airline. What we are going to do in this paper is very simple. We're going to generalize the story of these 4 pilots into all military pilots trained during World War II. We're going to compare the post-World War II lives of Black and white pilots in low and high discrimination counties. We're going to build a data set tracking these pilots' outcomes from birth to death, construct the book of life, if you allow me to use the term in the keynote. So I'm going to show you, compared to white pilots, if Black pilots live in counties with a higher discrimination level, they had lower SES from 1950 to the last moment of their life. I'm going to build an instrument based on this random geographic origin of their wartime peers, to identify the effect of discrimination on their outcomes. Let me tell you very quickly about the data. So what kind of SES outcomes we can measure for these pilots? So first, from the 1950 census, we can observe their income and occupation. Then we can get their income from the computational tax returns in 3 years, 1969, 74, and 79. Then we can observe their occupation again in the city directories between 1960 and 1990. We can also observe their address in the 1990s index to public records, and also we can estimate the price level, house price level at each address, so we can know the house price of this pilot 1990s address. Eventually, we can use the NIME identity data to get their death zip code, and also we'll know the income level for each zip code. By combining these 2 data sets, we can know how rich the neighborhood was at the last moment of their life. How can we measure the discrimination level for each county? We combine pre-World War II political, economic, and social outcomes through PCA. So this map shows you the distribution of our discrimination index in different counties in the US. And to give you a sense of the magnitude, these 2 red dots represent Richmond and New York. The difference between these 2 cities is around 1.8 standard deviation. Okay? So after World War II, these pilots were discharged. They went to different parts of the country, as you can see from a red circle on the map. Some went to the Jim Crow South, and some to more open northern cities. So we kind of have this natural experiment where a group of Black workers is gonna start their civilian life, but they had similar experience and skills. But they're gonna get exposed to different levels of discrimination, and we can track what happened to them after World War II. Here is the first figure in this table. It's a bean scatter plot between their income level in 1950 on the y-axis and the discrimination level of their residence county in the same year. If you look at the pilots in counties with the highest discrimination level, so they basically earned around $1,000 a year in 1950. But their peers in counties with the lowest discrimination levels, their income was around 4 or 5 times higher. So let me tell you what this $5,000 a year means in 1950. So when Bob Solow, the Nobel Prize winner in economics, so received the offer in 1949 as an assistant professor in economics in MIT, his salary was around $4,400 a year. So it means if a black pilot lived in a county with a very low discrimination level, they could earn more than an assistant professor in economics in MIT. But if you look at the white pilots, this relationship between income and discrimination is very flat. It's a little bit negative, but it's no longer statistically significant. We can observe the similar pattern for occupational ranking, for house price, for death, zip code, income ranking. One concern for this bean scatter plot is sorting. Maybe, this higher ability pilots would live in low discrimination counties. If that's the case, the bean scatter plots I showed you overestimate the effect of discrimination. So we did a lot of job trying to think about this sorting, and we have a lot of tests on this, but today I'm going to present you one solution, okay? One way to think about this is to build an instrument. What drives the locational choice in 1950, for example, for these pilots? We're going to use this quasi-random geographic origin of their wartime peers. We try to argue, based on our reading of how the Air Force assigned pilots to military, to the flight unit, the birth counties of people in the same flight unit are as good as random. Why? Because this selection process would wash out a lot of applicants in the process. It's really hard to manipulate this, who served with whom. So we are not the first to argue this. Alison Green has a John Market paper showing that's the case in the Navy. She showed that basically your peer's origin would affect your locational choice after World War II. We also show something like that. Basically, this table tells you if you have more peers from a specific county in 1950, you are more likely to live in that county. So as a consequence, we're going to build an instrument, basically use the discrimination level of your peers' birth counties as an instrument of your discrimination in your residence county in 1950. So here tells you the relationship between the endogenous variable and the instrument for black and white pilots. If we use that in an IV estimation, that's pretty much a very standard IV estimation. The key estimate is the beta 1 that tells you the cost of discrimination for black pilots. So here I just show you the estimate of beta 1 if we use different outcomes, including the occupational income ranking, the OC score, and also the occupational rank based on different measures, prestige, and also skill requirement. Let me just tell you how we think about the first estimate. So it tells you, compared to white pilots, one standard deviation higher discrimination led to around $1,200 lower occupational ranking for these black pilots. That's kind of like the income difference between a professional nurse and a waitress. So let me summarize what we do. I think the story we tell is very simple. It just tells you discrimination is detrimental for this Tuskegee Airmen over their entire life cycle. Is it surprising? Yes and no. So in the literature, in the discrimination literature in economics, we know discrimination is detrimental on average. But we often hear people tell us, cream always rises to the top, regardless how difficult the situation is, as long as you are truly talented, it doesn't matter, you will survive, you will prosper. It's not true, it's a lie. Actually, even for Tuskegee Airmen, these highly selected pilots, they also need a non-discriminatory environment to realize their potential. Thank you so much.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ainsworth. I'm a PhD candidate in education at the University of California, Irvine. I'll be presenting preliminary work today about the impact of becoming a parent on the career trajectories of K-12 teachers. This is joint work with a great group of collaborators that are all affiliated with the UC Irvine Center for Administrative Data Analysis, where we use linked administrative data to understand questions surrounding education and education policy. I'll note that I have a co-author from the Census Bureau, and this presentation represents our views and not the views of the US government or the Census Bureau. So today I'll be talking about teachers because we know that teacher quality matters to a host of short and long-run student outcomes. This has been demonstrated across a host of different countries and contexts. We know that students' human capital development can be heavily influenced by the quality of their teachers. At the same time, we know that recruiting and retaining effective teachers is a persistent challenge. In the US context, in the most recent years, attrition of early career teachers has increased such that we have a cycle of new teachers entering the profession, exiting, and then being replaced by new teachers. And so together, this makes it important to understand the factors that are drawing people into the profession or pushing them out of it at different stages, and how that might vary for different individuals. So to look at the career trajectories a bit here, I'm just plotting the 3-year exit rates by sex for all public school teachers in the state of Oregon using some data that I'll talk about later. But what we see here on the x-axis is age, and the y-axis is the probability that the individual exited teaching within 3 years. These are just from simple models that have school and year fixed effects that were comparing people of the same age in the same school in the same year. And what we see is that attrition is much higher earlier when teachers are younger. It declines and then increases later. But notably, there's a difference between men and women, such that women are 2 to 5 percentage points more likely to exit teaching from ages 25 to 36. And after that, those exit rates converge and stay the same for the rest of teachers' careers. And so this raises questions about what might be going on in this period to set up these different sort of career trajectories. We know this is a period when many individuals are making important decisions about family formation. And from a large literature in economics and sociology, we know that women in particular face disproportionate impacts of having a child. This is sometimes called the motherhood penalty or the child penalty. And here, penalty just refers to the differential impact for women of having a child versus men. So in the US context, we know that there's about a 15 percentage point penalty in employment in the US writ large, and about a 30% penalty in income. There are some groups for which that penalty is larger, such as married women, college-educated women, but it does appear across a host of different demographic groups. At this point, it's unclear what factors might mitigate the motherhood penalty. At least in the US context, we know that female executives in firms don't seem to make a difference. Although it is the case that more flexible jobs that allow for individuals to scale back or flexibly exit and re-enter, those occupations tend to have smaller penalties. And so this raises questions about what's going on in teaching. We know that it's a heavily female-dominated profession, where about 80% of teachers in the US are women. It also has some flexibility with the calendar that might be compatible with raising children. To this point, the evidence is mostly correlational. We know that motherhood is correlated with exit and reentry and correlated with a lower likelihood of becoming a principal. There's some evidence from economics showing that motherhood penalties are larger in the education sector writ large, but this is just using NAICS codes that kind of pool across lots of different employers and occupations within education and not necessarily teachers in particular. So with this paper, what we're hoping to do is provide plausibly causal evidence about the impact of parenthood on teachers and how that might be differential for women versus men. Look at impacts across the career trajectory on different job characteristics using some administrative data that we've linked. We also hope to explore some factors that might mitigate this penalty and sort of support teachers through that transition into parenthood. So these are our research questions. We are asking whether there are labor market and earnings gaps that emerge between men and women after becoming a first-time parent, and whether those vary based on marital status or primary earner status. Today I'll only have time to look at the marital status results. We asked if there are differences in career characteristics that emerge. Here we're thinking about part-time status, whether someone receives a promotion, and moonlighting. Finally, we asked if there are any factors that moderate the size of the motherhood penalty for teachers. This work is very preliminary, so for today I'll only be able to present results regarding principal sex and whether the principal is a parent. And relative to previous work, sort of looking at heads of firms or CEOs, this is a much more direct supervisor, which we're excited about. So to do this, we're going to be using linked K-12 administrative data from the Oregon Department of Education that has been securely linked with records at the U.S. Census Bureau using their PVS process that was discussed earlier. And what this allows us to do is examine earning trajectories of teachers who leave the K-12 education system in Oregon, maybe go to other states, go to other professions, as well as it allows us to look at the job characteristics of individuals while they're working in Oregon public schools, because these data cover the universe of employees in the state that work for a public school, including public charter schools. And so for our analysis, we're going to follow teachers who had a new child between 2007 and 2016, and we can follow them through the 2022 tax year. And we're going to focus on first children, which we're going to define and sort of infer from claiming of dependence on 1040s. So this results in a sample of 7,100 first-time teacher parents. If we're trying to understand the impact of this first child, we're going to use fairly standard event study models in this literature from economics. So we're going to look at individuals that were employed as a teacher in Oregon public schools in the year before their first child enters the home in T-1. And then we're going to estimate these models separately for women and men, where we'll be predicting employment and log earnings conditional employment, both overall and then within Oregon public schools. And then these models will also predict job characteristics. The models include age and year fixed effects, as well as indicators for school level, and they're going to be identified based off the fact that individuals have children at different ages. So we're going to run these models on subsets of teachers based on their sex, as well as their marital status, primary earner status, and the sex and parental status of their principal, all measured at T-1. So these can recover plausibly causal estimates of the impact of parenthood, and particularly on the differential impact of motherhood under some mild sort of standard event study assumptions that Unrit Cleven and Doug Allman and their colleagues have sort of established in a series of papers. So looking at our sample, we have about 2,000 men and 5,000 women that are first-time teacher parents. They look pretty similar in a lot of characteristics, but there are some differences to point out. The men are about 2 years older when they first have their first child. They have about 1 more year of experience as a teacher. They earn also about $4,000 more, about 10% more. We see that about 80% or north of 80% of both are married. When we look at the earnings of their spouses, we see that about 2/3 of men and half of women are the primary earner in their household. So now getting to the employment results, we're going to look at several of these event studies figures throughout the rest of the presentation, so I just wanted to orient us to them a little bit. On the x-axis, we have years relative to the first child entering the home, and on the where year 0 is that event of the first child. The y-axis is the probability here of any employment. And so we're going to plot models separately by sex. So here are the results for men. You see that employment is rising till that year before they have that first child, where we sort of fix the sample and then somewhat declines afterwards. When we look at the results for women, we see that prior to having that first child, their employment rates are evolving pretty similarly, but there's this gap that opens once that first child occurs. So here there's about a 12 percentage point penalty, and that's the the difference in the impact for women versus men. So I'll be referring to that as the penalty. So we see about a 12 percentage point penalty on average. When we look at whether individuals stay working in Oregon public schools, we see even bigger drops, both for men and for women. By year 10, there drops between 35 to 55 percentage points. But what we see, the drops are larger for women. So there's about a 15 percentage point penalty in exiting any type of employment in Oregon public schools. We can also look at heterogeneity by whether individuals are married versus not. So when we do that for overall employment, these are the results for married men and married women. We see those sort of employment gaps overall. But when we look at unmarried individuals, we don't see the same declines for women as we did among married teachers that are women. We can also look for employment in Oregon public schools. Here are again, the changes for married men and women. And when we look at unmarried individuals, we see that for women in particular, the drops are larger among those that are married. We can also look at earnings. So first, starting off with log earnings conditional on employment. This can be in Oregon or outside of Oregon public schools. And we see that men see some declines in earnings after their first child. This is somewhat different than what the previous literature shows. But I think it's consistent with a broader set of work showing that when teachers leave teaching, they typically make less money. And since a substantial share of men are leaving teaching after their first child, this would be consistent with that. When we look at women, though, we see a much larger decline in earnings, even though they were evolving relatively similarly beforehand, such that there's about a 40% difference in the impact. When we look at earnings for those that stay in Oregon public schools, we see men don't see any declines, but we still see this gap between men and women, that even those the 50 to 60% that stay working in Oregon public schools. There's about a 20% penalty that declines over time. Again, these results are driven largely by married women. So when we look at overall earnings, here's for married men and women, and you see that it's driven by married women. And also for earnings in Oregon public schools, this is for married men and women. And we see that the declines are all concentrated among women who are married. And so this raises questions for even those that continue and stay teaching in Oregon public schools, what might be going on for women to see these kinds of drops. So now we look at job characteristics using the administrative data from Oregon. So all of these analyses will now be conditional on remaining employed in Oregon public schools. And so what we see here, we're looking at the probability of working part-time. We see that when first-time teachers that are women have that first child, there's an increase of about 10 percentage points in the probability that they work part-time, but we don't see changes for men. We also look at promotions. So this is being promoted to an assistant principal or principal. There's no pre-period here because by definition, everyone's teaching in year T-1. But we do see that men are more likely to be promoted after having that first child, although there's some convergence over the long term. Finally, we look at whether individuals are moonlighting. So this is supplementing their income by working jobs outside of the public education system. And what we see here is that there's not any sort of differences by sex, but there's a 5 percentage point decrease overall. Next, we look at whether there's any differences by principal characteristics that teachers are working under when they have their first child. And there's really limited evidence of any sort of impacts here. We don't see that teachers are systematically moving to principals with different characteristics once they have a child. We don't see really any differences if the principal themselves is a parent. We do see some small differences where the earnings penalties and the employment declines are larger under principals of the same sex. So to illustrate that, this is the heterogeneity by overall earnings. Here I'm showing for men and women that are working under a female principal. And so when you look at those that are working under a male principal, that compresses somewhat. So men are doing a bit worse and women are doing a bit better. We're not entirely sure what explains this pattern, and we're hoping to look into some of the potentially regional differences that might be going on here. So to summarize, we see large motherhood penalties for teachers in post-kid employment and earnings, though both men and women are leaving teaching at high rates after having their first kid. Those penalties and earnings are somewhat attenuated for those that stay working in Oregon public schools, but they still do exist for women. And this can partly be explained because they're more likely to take on part-time work as a teacher and less likely to be promoted. So far, we don't see any evidence that principal characteristics are moderating any of these impacts, though. And so I think it highlights that this transition to parenthood can be a really critical juncture for teachers' career trajectories, and it's something we're looking forward to exploring more. This work is very preliminary. So as for some of our next steps, we have a host of other school characteristics that could be potentially relevant, like the availability of 4-day weeks or virtual teaching options, as well as working conditions related to student characteristics and other staff that we're hoping to look at. We also want to dig deeper into part-time and team teaching role availability across districts and how that figures into teachers' decisions. That's it from me. Thank you so much.
Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Guilherme. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Florida. Really a great pleasure to present today my paper called The Murillo, Campello, and Spyridon Lagaras for a paper titled Entrepreneurship on a Safety Net, Evidence from the World's Largest Cash Transfer Program. So here's the story. Cash transfers are commonly used as a way to alleviate poverty. There are cash transfer programs in place in many countries across the world, including Brazil, Mexico, India, Kenya. Over 70 countries use cash transfers to alleviate poverty, but these programs increasingly aim to not only alleviate poverty, but also promote human capital accumulation and economic mobility. And historically, one way through which human capital accumulation and economic mobility can be achieved is through entrepreneurship. However, a key tension in the design of these programs is that while the guaranteed income stream that is provided by the cash transfer can potentially enable entry into entrepreneurship by alleviating liquidity constraints, by providing insurance against failure, the income-based eligibility requirement of these programs might potentially discourage growth. Because as individuals become successful, increase their income, they lose access to program benefits. So a question that emerges is whether providing cash transfers to low-income populations is an effective way to promote productive entrepreneurship, human capital accumulation, or if it only creates dependence traps that actually discourage growth by beneficiaries. That's why to a lot of debate in the countries that have these programs in place because they are very costly. They can be 0.5%, even 1% of the GDP of the country in some cases. Critics to the way that these programs work, they tend to make arguments similar to what the Washington Post highlights. Cash alone proves inadequate to solve the problems of the poor. Similarly, the Wall Street Journal highlights that welfare is what is eating the budget. And more recently, a major news outlet in Brazil reported that 20% of the transfers in Brazil are being used on online bets. So evidence of misuse of these resources. But the governments that have these cash transfer programs in place, they tend to be very supportive of the programs. And here, as an example, I have Brazil's Ministry of Social Development, Wellington Dias, where Wellington specifically says that Bolsa Família, which is Brazil's cash transfer program, has supported millions who didn't even have money to eat and now have income from work and from entrepreneurship. He also states a clear goal of soon reaching 1 million beneficiaries who become entrepreneurs. So really betting very highly on entrepreneurship as a pathway for mobility in Brazil. Well, not only the governments argue that these transfers are meaningful, the beneficiaries also argue that these transfers are meaningful for them to achieve mobility. And here, as a final example, I have a former beneficiary in Brazil's Bolsa Família that specifically says that I started my business while receiving Bolsa Família, setting up a small stand, selling fruit cocktails, and today I'm a successful entrepreneur. I now have assets worth almost 1 million reais. So that's exactly the direction that we're going here in this paper. In this paper, we formally ask first whether cash transfers stimulate entry into entrepreneurship. Then we ask, conditioning on entering entrepreneurship, how the firms that are formed perform relative to the firms that are started by similar entrepreneurs. We look into the channels explaining any performance differentials between the two groups. And we finally ask whether these experiences ultimately generate economic mobility, human capital accumulation for beneficiaries, even if the business that they start fails. So we consider this question using a very novel combination of data sets. Some of them are linked for the first time, so we're very excited on the data front, and I'm going to discuss the data sets in a moment. But I'm going to start by characterizing the significant cash transfer program that we use in our paper. So in our paper, we focus on Brazil's Bolsa Família, which is the world's largest cash transfer program. It has over 17 million beneficiary families, so over a quarter of the households in Brazil participate in the program. It has a fiscal cost of over $8 billion per year. To be eligible to Bolsa Família in the first place, there is an income-based eligibility requirement, so families must be before the transfer with an income under 178 reais per capita per month, which is equivalent to $49 or 20% of the minimum wage in Brazil. And once enrolled, families receive a monthly transfer amount that depends on the specific level of poverty that the family is. So for those that are under what the government considers extreme poverty, these families receive both a basic benefit of 89 reais per capita per month, plus a variable benefit of 41 per child or pregnant women, while those that are just under the poverty line receive just a variable benefit of 41 per child or pregnant women. To give you some perspective on how firms look like in Brazil, since you also study firms, there are about 3 million new firms started each year in Brazil. And over 3/4 of these businesses are sole proprietorship businesses. It's really the entry point into entrepreneurship in Brazil. When you're looking into sole proprietorships, nearly all firms start under a regime that is called an individual micro-entrepreneur that has very low taxation, just about 1% of revenues, and allows for up to 81,000 reais in revenues per year or one employee besides the owner. If firms exceed either the revenue or the employment threshold, then they transition to what is called a micro-enterprise regime that has higher taxation, but also allows for more revenue and also more employment. So moving on to the data, which is something that we're very excited about in this paper. In this paper, we use 6 data sets that are sourced from the Brazilian government. We start with PNAD, which is a survey conducted at the household level by the US Census Bureau equivalent in Brazil, which is called IBGE. Then we use the firm registry data. That includes all firms that have been started over time in Brazil, both active and inactive, as well as the outcome of these firms. We develop a method to identify who is the founder or who are the founders in each firm funded over time in Brazil. And by doing so, we're the first paper to link at the individual level the firm registry data with the Bolsa Família payments data, where you can observe payments by beneficiary by month. We also use a data set where we can observe the whole employment universe in Brazil. So for each individual, we can see where the person worked over time, roles, salaries, and even demographic information. And finally, we use data on both small business loans as well as on debt collection proceedings. From these data sets, we collect firm entries and outcomes for a decade between 2014 and 2024. And we specifically focus on our main individual level analysis on sole proprietorship businesses started by first-time entrepreneurs with formal labor market experience. That's a first step towards making beneficiary and non-beneficiary entrepreneurs more comparable. We also take other steps that I'm going to discuss in a moment. But based on these sample screening criteria, we identify and track 2.3 million firms. And we specifically define as a cash transfer entrepreneur those that are currently enrolled in the program when they found their business, or those that had just left the program where they found the business. The idea being that the cash transfer was meaningful for them to become an entrepreneur in the first place. First question that we ask using these data sets is whether Bolsa Família stimulates entry into entrepreneurship. We do so using an instrumental variable approach where the instruments the share of households that are under the poverty line within a survey area, which is equivalent to a neighborhood in Brazil. So it's a two-stage least square where we use the share of households under the poverty line to predict the share of families that are participating in Bolsa Família within that survey area. In the second stage, the Perlman of interest captures the local average treatment effect of Bolsa Família participation on entry into entrepreneurship and also on the composition of entrepreneurs. We have a vector of controls for demographic characteristics as well as both survey area and state year fixed effects. In the first stage, we document that the share of families that are under the poverty line is a strong predictor of Bolsa Família participation, F statistic of over 900. In the second stage, we document that cash transfers do stimulate entry into entrepreneurship, and the composition of entrepreneurs also changes toward beneficiaries. But these results tell us that cash transfers do stimulate entrepreneurship, more beneficiaries become entrepreneur. Next, we look into how the businesses that are started perform relative to the businesses that are operated by similar entrepreneurs. But the challenge that we have here is that these beneficiaries are systematically different to other entrepreneurs. The main way that we address this is by using granular fixed effects. So we have at these individual level tests, control for entrepreneur characteristics as the joint profile of race, gender, education, age, or the time of business founding, and then a number of characteristics that are related to the job the person had immediately before founding the business. So you have the occupation, the salary type, and even the size of the employer that the person worked for. So this would be one unit of this fixed effect, for instance. We have a similar fixed effect for business characteristics as the joint profile of industry, equity, founding year. This would be one unit of this other fixed effect. When we introduce these fixed effects, the sample becomes balanced. We also use a secondary strategy of using a matched sample approach. And using these solutions, we estimate the following linear model, where the coefficient of interest is the differential performance for beneficiary versus non-beneficiary entrepreneurs. In addition to the fixed effects that I described, we cluster standard errors by municipality to account for correlation within local economic environments. From this test, we find the following. So first, starting with business survival and growth, beneficiaries, the business that are started by them, are 1 to 16% less likely to survive. You can see that the disadvantage grows over time. When it comes to business growth, so transitioning from individual micro-entrepreneur to micro-enterprise, the two regimes that I described earlier, they're 11 to 12% less likely to grow their business. They're also 38 to 42% less likely to generate employment besides the owner, and 45 to 65% less likely to have access to formal credit markets. We lastly look into whether these businesses are more problematic to the very government that is subsidizing their transfers, so we look into tax violation, which is not pay their business taxes, and beneficiaries, they are 40 to 47% more likely to incur tax violations, and 12 to 17% more likely to have debt collection proceedings. We conduct a number of extensions, robustness, and look into the channels that drive these results that I don't have time to cover now because I have a time constraint, but I'm happy to cover in the Q&A session. Last part that I'll cover today is whether these experiences ultimately generate human capital formation, economic mobility for beneficiaries, even though the entrepreneurship that cash transfers stimulate is not growth-oriented, as we just saw. So one of the ways they go about this is by checking what type of jobs they get after their business fails and they return to formal employment. So what type of jobs they get relative to the jobs they had immediately before entrepreneurship. So this is a specific regression equation they are estimating. So we're looking into the differential employment transition specifically for beneficiaries when controlling for their characteristics and the characteristics of the business that they start. And we find here that beneficiaries, they are equally as likely as other entrepreneurs to get managerial roles or white-collar positions, but they get better wages once they return to formal employment. They also transition into wage employment faster than other failed entrepreneurs, suggesting that even though the type of entrepreneurship that cash transfers stimulate is not growth-oriented, these experiences appear to be meaningful for beneficiaries in the sense that help them achieve better wages once they return to wage employment. So that's what I had for today. Thank you all so much. Look forward to questions at the end. Thank you.
So first, thanks to the organizers for having this paper on the program, and thanks everyone for coming. I'm Sophie, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Southern Denmark. Today, I'm going to present my paper, Returns to Education for Women, Evidence from U.S. Compulsory Schooling Laws. So as we may all know, the returns to education literature is one of the largest in labor economics. And an increasing body of work now examines women specifically, which is a development that is well justified. In the United States, for example, women now surpass men in college enrollment and completion, as well as the attainment of master's and doctoral degrees. So this paper examines a historical setting that mirrors this pattern, which is that during the early 20th century United States, women actually had slightly higher 8th grade and 12th grade completion rates than men. So specifically, if we look at the 1940 complete consensus data from IPUMS, the top two lines shows you that across all of these different birth cohorts, there is slightly higher share of women who completed 8th grade than the share of men, and the bottom two lines shows you that there is slightly higher share of women who completed 12th grade than the share of men. So although women attained relatively high levels of education, their access to labor market opportunities during this time period remained relatively limited. So in these contexts, returns to education for them must extend beyond earnings to other channels as well, such as their marriage market outcomes. So this paper asks three research questions. The first being, how does education affect women's labor market outcomes in terms of their labor force participation and conditional on employment, whether education enabled them to have a skilled occupation. And the second question is, how does education shape their marriage market outcomes, both regarding their decision to marry or not, and conditional on marriage, what is the quality of the match in the marriage market? And finally, how do these returns actually vary across socioeconomic backgrounds? So do women from lower socioeconomic backgrounds actually benefit more from education in these labor and marriage market outcomes? So since education is an endogenous choice, oral S is unlikely to capture the causal effect. So as a result, I exploit plausibly exogenous variations from the first wave of US state compulsory schooling laws and use these legally mandated attendance requirements as instruments for years of education. So these type of laws essentially provided cohort by state variations in the length of required compulsory schooling. So to dive into the details about these type of laws a little bit, the first big category is called the compulsory attendance laws, which set a minimum school entry age, a maximum school leaving age, and a minimum period that children should be in school. So states in the Northeast generally implemented these laws relatively early, while states in the South generally did not establish these type of laws until the early 1900s. So there are state by state and regional variations in when these laws were being implemented. And over the years, the laws were also updated to increase the length of mandatory attendance, such as by increasing the maximum school leaving age. So complementary to that, there was also a large wave of state-level child labor laws that was introduced during the early 1900s. So child labor laws often allow children to leave school for work by having some exemptions for them, saying that if you completed 8th grade, for example, then you were allowed to obtain a labor permit, and these type of laws also varied by state. And finally, there was also school continuation laws at the state level, which required working children who are still under the maximum school leaving age to attend school during their spare time. So the required school time was quite short, but essentially it increased the opportunity cost of hiring children because they might not always be excused from school. So these three types of laws generated variations in the length of compulsory schooling required. So this map shows you that for children born in 1880, if you live within the South, you were generally not required to go to school. But if you live outside of the South, you were generally required to go to school for maybe 1 to 5 years, or 6 years, or 7 years. And for later birth cohorts, the length of compulsory schooling were increased. So if you live outside the South, you were generally required to go to school for 8 years. And then for children born in 1910, even if you live within the South, you were required to go to school for some period of time. And for children who live outside the South, there are a few states that require you to go to school for 9 years or 10 years, which means that you're required to obtain some level of high school education. So these are the variations that I'm going to use in the instruments, which I'm going to instrument it for years of education. And the data on these type of laws were obtained from the Clay et al. 2021 paper, which already extended a lot of the data collection efforts on compulsory schooling laws from previous studies. And the data on women's labor market and marriage market outcomes, as well as their education information, are from the 1940 complete consensus. The sample here is being restricted to native-born white women who were born between 1885 and 1912. So foreign-born individuals are not included in the sample because they might not have completed schooling in the US and the US South. And Black women were also not included in the sample since the US South was quite late in introducing state schooling laws and had relatively weak enforcement. And in order to study also the heterogeneous effects based on family socioeconomic background, I used the census tree link data. So these census tree data relied on user-contributed links from familysearch.org, which is a genealogy platform where users find their ancestors, and this really overcome the difficulty of linking women longitudinally since they often change their last name after marriage. So specifically, I'm using the census tree link data to follow women in the 1940 census back to their childhood censuses, so either in 1900, 1910, or 1920. And the information on their father's occupation or occupational score are being used as measures of their socioeconomic background, and I additionally also use the father's farm status or urban status as a measure for their socioeconomic background as well. So moving on to the first stage results, where I talk about whether these type of laws were actually effective in increasing women's years of educational attainment. So the outcome variable is years of education completed, and the independent variable, so the instruments here, are dummy variables equal to 1 if the type of laws are required to go to school for 6 years or 7 years or 8 years and 9 years or above. And the omitted category is the type of laws are required to go to school for 0 to 5 years. So column 1 shows you that the type of laws that require children to go to school for 7 years, 8 years, and 9 years or above are quite effective in increasing women's educational attainment. And the rest of the columns essentially shows you that the coefficients are quite similar if we restrict the analysis to subgroups of women that might show up in the later analysis, such as married women working women, sample line women from the census, which got asked more questions, and women from outside of the South. If we look at the first stage results by socioeconomic background, we notice something interesting. So this means the comparison between columns 2 and 3, as well as the comparison between columns 4 and 5. So for women from relatively high socioeconomic background, these type of laws were quite effective in general to increase their years of education accomplished, which also implies that they were more likely to comply with these type of laws. While on the other hand, for women from relatively low socioeconomic background, only the type of laws that require them to go to school for 9 years or 10 years were effective in increasing their years of education accomplished. And my interpretation is that it definitely has something to do with the opportunity cost of education for women from different socioeconomic background. So for women from low SES households, specifically, having some kind of high school level of education might change your labor market prospects and marriage market prospects substantially, so they were more likely to comply with these type of laws relative to the types that only require them to go to school to accomplish 8th grade, for example. So for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to show you the results. The first outcome variable we're interested in is whether education allowed women to have a gainful occupation in 1940. So in column 1, the ORS estimate suggests that an initial year of education increased the probability of the woman reporting a gainful occupation in 1940 by 2.2 percentage points, while the IV estimate is much larger, around 7.1 percentage points. Consistent with that, column 2 and 3 also shows you that an initial year of education was effective in increasing women's labor supply as well. In column 4, here I restrict the sample to working women who are earning positive wages, and a condition on that sample, and the initial year of education increased women's wage earning by 11% to 17%, which is a quite large effect. And partially it is also because that an initial year of education increased the probability of women having a skilled occupation, such as a stenographer, a clerical worker, or a bookkeeper in columns 5 to 7, but reduced the probability of the woman being in a relatively unskilled occupation, such as a housekeeper in column 8. And if we look at the results by socioeconomic background, we see that in the labor market, women from relatively lower socioeconomic background benefited more when comparing the results from panel A to panel B. In the marriage market outcomes, I think I will just jump to the results by SES directly, because here it actually vary a lot. So in panel A, we see that for women from relatively high socioeconomic backgrounds, education did not affect their probability of being never married or the probability of being divorced, but it mainly increased their age at first marriage, so essentially delayed their age at first marriage. While in contrast, in panel B, we see that for women from relatively lower socioeconomic background, an additional year of education mainly increased the probability of them remaining never married and the probability of divorce, but conditional on marriage, there was very little effect on age at first marriage. So it essentially says that education allowed these women to be able to stay unmarried for longer, and some of them might have avoided marriage altogether, so avoided a relatively lower quality match in the marriage market. And the last set of results concerns what I call the match quality in the marriage market, which is conditional on the sample of married women and measured by their husband's status. So in these specifications, the husband's education was also being controlled. So we interpret the coefficients as the relatively independent effect of the wife's education. So column 1 specifically shows you that the initial year of the wife's education is negatively correlated with the probability of the husband's being unemployed in 1940, which is an interesting outcome to study since this was only a few years after the Great Depression, and 13% of the husbands in the sample were either unemployed or working at government emergency work. Although the wife's education had little effect on the husband's occupational score or their labor supply, in column 5, and they show year of the wife's education is positively correlated with maybe 7.4% increase of the husband's wage earning, with the coefficient being marginally significant at the 10% level. So there is some suggestive evidence to show that education enabled women to be able to match with relatively higher quality match, as reflected through the husband's unemployment status and the husband's wage earnings. And in these set of outcomes, we also see that women from lower socioeconomic backgrounds generally benefited more from education. And I think I have run out of time, so I'm just going to stop at my conclusion slides.
Hi everyone, I'm Becca Brough, and today I'll talk about access to teaching and women's long-run outcomes. So as motivation, women's rise in the labor force was one of the largest economic shifts across the 20th century. This is argued by Claudia Golden. But underlying this are sort of two key distinct patterns that I want to highlight today. First is women's entry into white-collar and professional work, and second is women's persistence in the labor force, and in particular her persistence through marriage. This rise in labor force participation is going to coincide with major demographic shifts, so in particular declines and delays in marriage and fertility. And so this raises sort of this central question in the gender and labor literature, which is, does access to professional work causally affect women's marriage and fertility outcomes? This is central to sort of both classical and modern theories of fertility, and then also for policymakers today who are continuing to think about fertility rates that are below replacement levels. However, studying this question is going to pose a lot of empirical challenges for researchers. So what we're interested in is connecting sort of labor market outcomes with family outcomes. But you could see that really the relationship could go either way. Maybe women's access to the labor market changes her family outcomes. Alternatively, sort of preferences or factors that shape family can drive labor force decisions. And so disentangling this is going to be challenging, right? Obviously, women who choose to be in the labor force or women who choose to marry, it's going to be not random. And so in this paper, what I'm going to do is exploit a historical natural experiment that's going to give me exogenous and variation in women's access to labor market opportunities, which is going to allow me to sort of trace the causal effect from access to the labor market to her family outcomes. So kind of the project in summary, I'm going to ask specifically, how does access to the teaching occupation in young adulthood affect women's labor, marriage, and fertility outcomes? The idea is I'll be focusing on a setting where teaching was a critical occupation for women, and so losing access to this single occupation, I will show, but is reasonable to assume that it will affect her trajectory in the labor force as a whole. I focus on 1916 to 1923 in Illinois, where 50% of elementary school teachers are going to be obtaining their credentials through a state-administered exam. This is going to allow me to use a regression discontinuity design around sort of exam pass thresholds to compare women who are marginally passing to those who are marginally failing, sort of in this 1916 to 1923 window, and follow them sort of across the long run. I think my main contribution to the literature, so first I built on a large literature focused on women's labor force, so sort of most notably shocks focused on World War II shocks, but a more recent literature has studied shocks to specific occupations using the linked censuses. And I think my main contribution is going to be able to provide sort of an individual level shock, sort of holding her other labor market opportunities fixed and trace this across the life cycle. So why am I going to focus on teaching to study sort of this broad question of women's access to the labor market? Well, teaching is super important. So in 1920, it's going to make up 25% of women's white-collar work, and it's also going to be one of the highest paying occupations available to women. So here on the x-axis, it's the number of women employed, and the y-axis is going to be the occupation score, which is based on a leader census. But in the paper, what I do is collect some data on teaching wages compared to other white-collar occupations of the civil service in sort of the 1920s, and I show that even sort of then, teaching is a relatively high-pay occupation. Illinois is going to provide the sort of ideal natural experiment to study this. In 1914, they introduced a system to standardize teaching quality across the state, and so they introduced this exam system to sort of, in the hopes of standardizing this quality. It's going to be important. 50% of eventual elementary school teachers are going to gain their credentials to be a teacher through this exam system. And then it has several features that are beneficial for a regression discontinuity context. So mainly, it's going to be graded by a state board of examiners, and it's going to be graded anonymously. And so this is going to be really nice. We're often concerned about manipulation or how this is being graded. So it being graded anonymously is nice. Conditional on passing this exam, this makes one eligible to receive a teaching certificate, but it doesn't guarantee them entry into the teaching occupation. So just because you're eligible to receive a certificate, you still have to be formally hired by your county superintendent. And then the certificate, so conditional on getting a certificate, this is going to be valid for 2 years and then renewable upon superintendent recommendation. And this is going to be an important feature in my setting because I'm going to argue that this isn't just sort of 1 year access to the teaching occupation, but this is potentially access to teaching for a long time, right? For a career, right? As long as you kind of continue to get recommended, you could be a teacher for the next 30 years. And then to pass, you had to meet sort of specific requirements that I will talk about. Most importantly, you had to get a 75% sort of across 13 exams. These 13 exams were taken across 2 days, so it was a pretty arduous exam system. And then you had to meet an average 60 minimum requirement on each of these exams. There were alternative ways to become a teacher. So in particular, if you entered college or normal school, which was sort of teacher training colleges, but this is going to be costly. This is a 2 or 4 year investment. And then alternatively, there's provisional or temporary certificates that are often used in the cases of teacher shortages, but these are non-renewable and available for a single year, right? So the certificate is really sort of the best way to access it for the long run. But all of these sort of features mean that what I'm going to be able to identify is like a fuzzy regression discontinuity. So there's going to be people who fail my exam who still become teachers, and there's going to be people who pass who never become teachers. So the data sources, so first I will go to the Illinois State Archives and digitize exam ledgers. These are going to be great, and they're going to include sort of exactly the exam scores for these test takers. It'll be for all of Illinois except Cook, so this includes Chicago. So we want to be thinking about sort of rural Illinois as mainly the sample. I have a lot of information on these candidates, so their name, their age, and their address, which I can use to link to the censuses. And then, of course, for all my outcome, I'm going to be relying on the full count censuses. And so to get a sense of the matching strategy, what I start with is these exams at the bottom. Women are very young when they're taking their exam, so on average 18 or 19, and all of them are not married when they take their exam. So I use their maiden name to link them to a childhood census, so to the most close census sort of before they took their exam, and then follow them forward. So to get a sense of the empirical strategy, on the left is sort of these rosters that I'm using. I digitize them with the help of Gemini, which is amazing. And so to get a sense of the data that I'm using is for each candidate, I'm able to extract sort of their average score, their minimum score, the sum, and sort of the result, whether they passed or failed. And so essentially what I'm going to be doing is comparing people who scored just above an average of 75, which corresponds to like a sum across the 13 exams of 975 points, to people below that. And so I'll sort of skip this is just sort of a formal regression discontinuity. And important things are about like the assumption. So one, we want to make sure that baseline characteristics are smooth across the threshold, which I find is the case. And then also we're worried about bunching, so whether people could manipulate to be on either sides of the threshold. I do find that there's sort of manipulation at this minimum of 60. So once I kind of do some work in the data to correct for that, I find there's smoothness in the average distribution. And so moving to results, I find that women are 13 percentage points more likely to ever be a teacher in sort of the subsequent censuses. So this is about 45%. And I find these effects are very sticky. So they last into the very long run. So even by the 1940 census, this is around 20 years after women are taking the exam, they're still around 8 or 9 percentage points more likely to be a teacher. Right, and so we can kind of think about this as like a first stage, right? I said these women are eligible to be teachers, and now I'm saying that they are teachers. What's maybe more interesting, however, is that I also find that these effects persist into the labor market. So women are 11 percentage points more likely to ever be observed in the labor force, which means that the marginal woman, in my case, who's kind of being deterred from being a teacher because of the setting, is also not entering the labor force as a whole. And these effects are also really sticky into the long run. So even by 1940, women are still in the labor force. This translates to around 30% higher income, but this is almost entirely based on the extensive margin. So the fact that women are still in the labor force by 1940. And then I find pretty large and lasting effects on their family formation. So they're more likely to be never married in 1930. It catches up a little bit by 1940, but there's a 6 percentage points, so like a good stock, who's still never married by 1940. As well as effects on fertility. So I see an overall large decline in fertility, but this is driven primarily by childlessness. So women who by 1940, so on average, women are around 38 at this point, haven't had a child yet, and less so driven by sort of the intensive margin. So conditional on having a child, women seem to kind of catch up in terms of the number of children, and this is despite the fact that they start their fertility later. So they have their first child later. And so what I do a little bit more in the paper is try to explain understand what explains such strong persistence in the labor force, and in particular in teaching. And I identify two sort of critical features. So first, I do find in my setting that married women persist in the labor force. So part of around a third of this 1940 labor force effect is also driven by married women. And this is concentrated in places where there was allowed. So essentially, marriage bars are restrictions, occupational restrictions against married women from working. And I find in the locations where these weren't in place, and so this comes from another project that I am working on with a graduate student, Jiang, where we collect sort of the locations of these marriage bars. I find that sort of areas that don't have these allowed women to stay in the labor market even after marriage. And then I find that education is an additional important feature. So I find that even after acquiring the certification, women go on to get additional education, driven in particular by the college margin, and this allows them to, so sort of among the women that are getting additional education, these are the ones who are persisting as teachers in 1940. And so I think this is sort of an interesting mechanism that, we typically think about education as like driving a career. In this setting, I find that initial adulthood access to a career also drives sort of educational investment. I think I'm at time, so there's other results, and I'll just stay at my conclusion. Thank you very much.